Welcome back, everyone. We thought it was over the moment Clara walked into that courtroom, pregnant and proud, didn't we? When Richard froze in front of the world, humiliated, it felt like the end. But storms don't die when the gavel falls. For Richard, the real nightmare had only just begun. What happened next will leave you stunned, and prove that sometimes silence is only the beginning of the story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's dive into part 2. The courtroom was empty now, but for Richard Hale, silence was more punishing than noise. He sat slumped at the defense table, his once polished posture bent like a man years older. The echo of Clara's entrance still rang in his ears. The heavy slam of the double doors, the gasp of the gallery, her calm hand resting on the curve of her stomach. The image haunted him. He pressed trembling fingers against his temples. No, he whispered into the void. It can't be. It can't. But the silence didn't comfort him. It mocked him. From the gallery seats, the faintest whisper lingered in his mind. Voices of neighbors, reporters, strangers. So, it was him all along. She carried his shame for years. He lied to everyone. Richard's cufflinks glinted under the fading fluorescent lights, but instead of symbols of status, they felt like shackles. He tugged at them, suddenly desperate to be rid of the very things that once made him proud. The bailiff's footsteps faded down the hall. The last of the reporters' pens stopped scratching. The judge's bench stood cold and silent. And still, Richard sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him. The chair Clara had filled not with words, but with presence. He could almost hear her voice again. So tell me, Richard, what do you see now? The words cut deeper than the gavel that adjourned his marriage. Outside, flashes from cameras erupted as Clara walked down the marble steps, head high, hand over her belly, dignified as ever. People reached for her, whispers following in waves, but she didn't stop. She didn't need to. The truth had already walked out with her. And Richard remained behind, a man left to choke on the ashes of his pride. He finally rose, his chair screeching against the floor. His legs were weak, his mouth dry, his chest pounding as though the walls themselves were pressing in. He staggered toward the exit, gripping the wooden rail for balance. When he reached the corridor, the silence hit harder than the noise inside. He pulled his phone from his pocket. Dozens of notifications flashed across the screen. Missed calls, messages, headlines. His sister's text was the first he read. You humiliated us. After everything she endured, it was you all along. Don't come near us, Richard. Another came seconds later, from a longtime business partner. We can't be associated with you anymore. Clients are already asking questions. Richard's stomach turned. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the polished floor, the phone slipping from his hand. The man who once strutted into every room now couldn't even stand upright. As the courthouse emptied, a janitor pushed a cart past him, glancing down with faint pity before continuing wordlessly. Even strangers could see it, the collapse of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Richard buried his face in his hands, his cufflinks pressed cold against his skin. For the first time in years, he had no words, no excuses, no mask to hide behind. All he had was silence. But silence, he was beginning to realize, was far louder than he had ever imagined. When he finally stumbled out into the fading daylight, the press was gone. Clara had taken all the attention with her, leaving him alone on the courthouse steps. His shoes scuffed against the stone as he descended, each step heavier than the last. He looked around, half expecting Elaine to appear from the shadows, her usual smile waiting to reassure him. But she wasn't there. No one was. For a moment, Richard thought about chasing after Clara, demanding an explanation, screaming that it was impossible. But what would he say? What words could undo the image burned into every witness's memory? The image of his wife, glowing with life, while he sat drowning in his own lies. His throat tightened. He turned and walked toward the parking lot, the weight of humiliation pressing harder with each step. And in that moment, as the courthouse loomed behind him, Richard Hale realized something that chilled him deeper than Clara's reveal. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of his descent. Richard didn't go straight home that night. He couldn't. Home was no longer a refuge. It was a graveyard of every lie he had ever told. Instead, he sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot, engine off, the silence suffocating. His reflection in the windshield looked back at him, pale, hollow-eyed, a man who had aged a decade in one afternoon. But worse than the silence were the memories. They came uninvited, crawling out of the shadows like ghosts. He saw Clara at the long oak dining table years ago, sitting stiffly as his mother leaned across her plate with pity in her eyes. "Still nothing, dear?" she asked, her voice sweet but sharp. "I prayed for you again this morning." Clara had smiled faintly, nodding, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. But Richard had watched, and instead of protecting her, he had piled on. "She tries," he had muttered to his father with a laugh. "But some women just aren't built for legacy." The memory burned now. He remembered the way Clara's fork trembled slightly as she lifted it, her silence more dignified than any outburst. Another ghost. A baby shower for his cousin. Pink balloons, laughter, gifts stacked high. Clara had stood in the corner, holding a tray of cupcakes, smiling politely as the other women surrounded the new mother. He had watched them look at her, their eyes sympathetic, pitying. "Don't worry," one of them had whispered loud enough for him to hear. "Your time will come." Richard remembered what he had done. He had leaned close and hissed, "Stop standing there like you're waiting for pity. You're embarrassing me." Her eyes had glistened, but she said nothing. She had never said anything. Now, in the dark car, Richard groaned and buried his face in his hands. The worst ghost came from the church pews, a Sunday morning years ago. The pastor had prayed openly for the couple's longing for children. Heads had turned, eyes darted toward them. Richard remembered the weight of every stare, every whispered, "Bless her womb." He remembered Clara's straight back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face serene. And he remembered his own words when they got home. "You made me look like a fool," he had spat, sitting there letting them pity me. "Do you enjoy being the barren wife?" He had said it like a curse, never knowing it was he who carried the emptiness. The ghosts swirled around him, refusing to let go. Richard gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He tried to shake the memories away, but they clung to him. Clara's calm eyes haunted him, the same calm that had shattered him in court. He saw her again, standing in that doorway, hand on her belly, dignity radiating from her like light. The gavel had slammed, the crowd had gasped, and Richard had crumbled. Now he couldn't escape it. "No," he muttered into the silence. "It's not over. That child. It has to be mine. It has to be." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. His mind twisted between past and present, between humiliation and desperation. At home, the house was dark when he finally stumbled inside. He poured himself whiskey, the burn searing his throat. He stood in the living room, staring at the photographs on the mantel. Vacations, anniversaries, posed smiles. Clara's face was there in every frame, calm, silent, untouchable. He ripped one photo from its frame, the glass shattering at his feet. In the picture, Clara stood beside him at a charity gala, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile gentle. He remembered how many people had told him that night, "You're a lucky man." He had never believed them. Until now. And the phone buzzed on the counter. Another message. This one from an old friend. "Richard, I can't defend you. Everyone knows. She carried your shame, and you made her suffer for it. You ruined her name, and now yours is ruined too. Richard hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud. He staggered to the couch and collapsed, head in his hands. The whiskey glass trembled in his grip, liquid spilling onto the carpet. He whispered into the darkness. She should have stayed silent. She should have stayed broken. But deep down, he knew. Clara's silence had never been broken. It had been sharpened, honed, waiting for the right moment to strike. And strike it had. He closed his eyes, but the memories didn't fade. They sharpened. He saw her face at the baby shower, her eyes at the dining table, her calm in the church pews. He had thought silence meant weakness, but it had been her shield, her weapon, her strength. Now that strength had buried him. Richard jolted awake hours later, drenched in sweat. He had dreamed of Clara again. Only this time she had stood at the foot of his bed, her hand on her stomach, whispering, "What do you see now?" He had screamed himself awake. The clock read 3:17 a.m. He poured another drink, but it didn't drown the sound of her voice. It didn't erase the memories. It didn't silence the ghosts. And it didn't quiet the single thought now consuming him. If Clara was pregnant, then the storm wasn't over. The storm had only just begun. Richard hadn't slept properly in days. The whiskey bottles on his desk multiplied, their amber glow catching the faint light of the lamp that burned endlessly in his study. But it wasn't the liquor that kept him awake. It was the memory. Clara. Hand on her stomach, calm, victorious, untouchable. It was an image that had rooted itself in his brain like a parasite, and now it whispered one thought louder than the rest. That child must be mine. On the third sleepless night, Richard spread papers across the floor like a man possessed. Old calendars, appointment books, credit card statements. He rifled through them as though the truth could be found in receipts and ink. March, he muttered, scribbling with shaking hands. That was the night. He wrote dates on scraps of paper, tossed them aside, picked them up again. His handwriting was jagged, frantic. Clara's face flickered in his memory. The faint smile she gave him at dinner one evening in March, the way she had quietly filled his glass without meeting his eyes. He remembered they had argued earlier that week, but that night, they hadn't. March, he said again, his voice cracking. It's mine. It has to be. He circled the month in red, again and again, until the ink tore through the paper. Downstairs his phone buzzed. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. A voicemail from his mother this time. He played it once, her voice low, weary. Richard, stop calling us. You've brought enough shame on this family. Don't make it worse. Clara carried you for years. We all see it now. Let her go. He slammed the phone shut, bile rising in his throat. Let her go? No. He couldn't. He wouldn't. She's mine, he muttered into the empty house. And if she's carrying life, it started under my roof. The silence swallowed his words. But silence wasn't his only enemy. It was Clara's calm that gnawed at him. Every newspaper he opened, every whisper he overheard, carried her name now. Clara Hale, the woman who endured humiliation and walked out victorious. Photographs of her leaving the courthouse had spread everywhere. She looked radiant, glowing even under the harsh flashes of cameras. Headlines called her dignified, the picture of strength. And Richard was the husband who lied, the man who blamed the wrong woman, the fraud. The world was falling at Clara's feet, and he was sinking beneath it. One night Richard stared at the empty chair across the dining table. For years Clara had sat there silently while he barked, mocked, sneered. For years he had mistaken her quiet for surrender. Now the chair was empty and it mocked him. He slammed his fist against the table. "That child is mine," he roared, though no one was there to hear. The glass rattled, whiskey spilling across the polished wood. His reflection stared back at him from the puddle, red-eyed, hollow, broken. But beneath the madness, a new resolve began to form. If the world believed the child wasn't his, he would prove them wrong. He would prove Clara wrong. He pulled his laptop closer, typing into the search bar with trembling hands. DNA testing during pregnancy, custody battles, paternity rights. His screen lit with possibilities. Lawyers, clinics, strategies. And with every click, his obsession sharpened. Meanwhile, whispers in town grew louder. Neighbors gossiped. Friends of friends whispered over coffee. "Did you hear? Clara's expecting? She looks happier now than ever." Some swore they had seen her at the market, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Others said she smiled more now, spoke more. That she was free. For the first time, Richard realized he was the outsider in every story. He was no longer the successful husband with influence. He was the villain. And Clara was the heroine. The thought made him tremble. Rage, jealousy, desperation. They twisted together until he could no longer tell one from the other. A week after the trial, Richard sat in his car outside a clinic, the same clinic Clara had once visited in silence. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly it creaked beneath his hands. He hadn't gone inside, he didn't need to. He knew why she had been there. She knew, he whispered. She knew it wasn't her. He closed his eyes and saw the papers she had handed the judge. Proof that it had always been him. Proof that he was the failure. His breath came in ragged gasps. He slammed his fist against the wheel until his knuckles split. Blood smeared across the leather, but he didn't stop. "This isn't over," he hissed. "It can't be over." That night, Richard dreamt of Clara again. She stood in the courtroom doorway, her hand on her belly, her face serene. But this time, she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood beside her, a man whose face Richard couldn't see. The man's hand rested protectively on Clara's back. Together, they walked forward, radiant and untouchable, while Richard stood frozen, drowning in the gallery's laughter. He jolted awake, heart hammering, drenched in sweat. The nightmare clung to him like a second skin. And as he stumbled to the sink, splashing cold water on his face, one thought consumed him. If Clara had found another man, if the child was his, Richard would never forgive her. But if the child was his own, if it was truly his blood, then he would never let her take it away. The denial hardened into obsession. Richard wasn't going to let the world rewrite his story. He wasn't going to let Clara stand victorious while he drowned. He leaned over the sink, eyes wild in the mirror. His voice cracked, but his conviction was sharp. That baby is mine, and she will not take it from me. Richard Hale had once been a man people couldn't ignore. His phone buzzed with invitations, deals, meetings, dinners. His name carried weight. His presence filled rooms. Now his phone only rang with silence. The calls stopped. The emails vanished. And when the world finally spoke again, it was through headlines that cut deeper than Clara's words ever had. Husband exposed as liar in courtroom showdown. Businessman blames wife for infertility. Documents prove it was him. Clara Hale, the silent wife who won. Every paper, every website, every whisper in town carried his name like poison. Richard slammed the laptop shut, his chest burning. He reached for the whiskey bottle, pouring another glass with shaking hands. The liquid sloshed over the rim, dripping onto the floor. But he didn't care. He sat in the dim light of his study, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, empty glasses, and the suffocating stench of his own downfall. He had always thought of whiskey as a companion, the drink of men who celebrated victories. Now it was nothing but anesthesia, dulling the pounding in his head, softening the ghosts of Clara's face. But even whiskey couldn't drown the silence. It was everywhere, in the empty living room where Clara once hummed softly while folding laundry, in the kitchen where her teacup sat abandoned in the cupboard, in their bedroom where the absence of her perfume pressed against him like a weight. Silence had been her weapon, and now it was his punishment. The world didn't just abandon him, it mocked him. Old friends avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Former colleagues crossed the street when they saw him coming. Even family gatherings became landmines. His father, once so proud of his successful son, barely looked at him now. One evening, Richard tried to visit, but his father stirred his coffee in silence, refusing to meet his eyes. His mother stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, whispering only one thing. Clara deserved better. Richard left before the coffee even cooled. He grew more restless by the day. Nights became his prison. He tossed and turned in the empty bed, dreams pulling him into Clara's orbit again and again. In one nightmare, she stood in the courtroom doorway as before, but this time the baby in her arms reached for him. He stepped forward, desperate, but she pulled the child closer to her chest and turned away. The gallery laughed, the judge shook his head, and Richard collapsed in shame. He woke up drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets as though they could anchor him to reality. The sheets smelled of nothing. No trace of her, no comfort, only emptiness. By day, he sat in his study with the blinds drawn, laptop glowing. His searches grew darker, more desperate. How to demand a DNA test before birth. Custody rights for unborn children. How to prove paternity in court. He clicked through websites half drunk, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Every page promised hope, but every page also whispered a truth he couldn't bear. The law would see him for what he was, a liar, a fraud, a man without credibility. Meanwhile, Clara's name was on every lip. He overheard it at the gas station, whispered by two women filling their tanks. Did you hear about Clara Hale? Pregnant, after all these years. She's glowing, they say. At the cafe, two men at the counter shook their heads. She carried his shame, poor thing. And look at her now. Strong, graceful. It's him who looks barren. Richard clenched his fist so tightly his nails dug into his palms. How dare they? How dare the world flip the story he had built? The spiral deepened. He stopped shaving. His crisp suits, once symbols of pride, hung wrinkled in the closet. The cufflinks he once polished every morning sat forgotten on the desk. Instead, he wore the same stained shirt for days, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. The man who had once commanded rooms now stumbled from bottle to bottle, haunted and alone. Late one night, as the rain beat against the windows, Richard sat hunched over his desk, scribbling on a yellow notepad. Dates, names, calculations. He wrote and rewrote them, arrows connecting one moment to the next. This proves it, he muttered, tapping the page. This proves the child is mine. But even as the words left his lips, his voice trembled with doubt. He stared at the wall, where Clara's face seemed to hover in the shadows. Her calm eyes looked through him, the same eyes that had shattered him in court. He hurled the notepad across the room, the pages scattering like leaves. "This isn't over," he screamed into the empty house. But no one answered. Only the rain, tapping steadily against the glass, reminding him that storms don't end when you will them to. They end when they destroy you. Richard told himself he wasn't following her. He was just driving. Just taking the long way around. Just happening to pass the quiet street where she now lived. But every night his car ended up there. He parked half a block away, headlights off, fingers tapping the steering wheel in a slow, feverish rhythm. He told himself he would leave after 5 minutes. 10 at most. Just long enough to see her walk past the window to prove to himself she was real. But minutes turned into hours. And still, he watched. The first night she appeared at the window, her figure framed by the warm lamplight. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She moved slowly, one hand resting on her stomach as though it were a crown she carried with reverence. Richard's chest tightened. She looked radiant, not broken, not bitter, not the silent shadow he had carved her into for years. Radiant. He gripped the steering wheel harder, nails digging into the leather. That glow, he whispered. That's mine. It has to be. But then, as he stared through the windshield, another silhouette moved across the window. A man. It was quick, just a flicker, a shadow moving behind her. His hand reached briefly into the light, brushing hers as she turned, smiling faintly at him. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. His breath hitched. No, he muttered, eyes wide. No, no, no. The second night he came back. This time he parked closer. Rain streaked across the windshield, blurring the light into halos. He leaned forward, eyes straining. There she was again. At the window, folding small clothes, baby clothes. She held up a pale blue onesie, smiling softly before laying it carefully on the armchair. Then that shadow appeared again. A man's hand reached to take the folded fabric from her. Their fingers touched. She laughed, a sound so faint through the glass yet sharp enough to cut Richard's chest in two. His grip on the wheel shook violently. She's mine, he whispered, his voice breaking. She belongs to me. That child belongs to me. But deep down, a darker thought gnawed at him. What if she wasn't his anymore? What if she never had been? The world outside the car seemed alive with whispers. The houses, the lampposts, the pavement itself seemed to mock him. She doesn't need you. She never did. She's stronger now than she ever was with you. He slammed his fist against the dashboard. No. The horn blared in the night, startling him. He ducked low in the seat, heart hammering. What if she heard? What if she came to the window and saw him, crouched in his own shame? But she didn't come. She didn't need to. Everywhere he went, Clara's ghost followed him. At the grocery store, he saw a woman with her same walk, her same soft smile. He followed her down 2 aisles before realizing it wasn't her. At the cafe, he heard laughter that sounded like hers and turned, only to find strangers staring back at him. At church, when the choir sang, he saw her face in the congregation, calm and unshaken. He stumbled out before the sermon ended, sweat dripping down his back. Clara wasn't haunting him because she wanted to. She haunted him because he could no longer escape her. The whispers in town grew louder. She looks happier now than ever. Pregnancy suits her. She's finally free. Richard overheard them in parking lots and gas stations and the quiet murmurs of strangers who thought he couldn't hear. He clenched his fists until his knuckles bled. Free? No. She couldn't be free. Not from him. Not from the life he had built. That child tied her to him forever. And yet, watching her from the shadows, Richard realized something more terrifying than the thought of losing her. She was already gone. One night, as the streetlight flickered overhead, Richard leaned against the cold steering wheel, watching Clara move through her new home. She set a small vase of flowers on the table. She lit a candle. She sat in the armchair with a book, her hand on her stomach, serene. He pressed his forehead against the glass of the window, breath fogging the windshield. She looked peaceful. She looked untouchable. And for the first time, Richard felt it, the crushing weight of powerlessness. He had spent years silencing her, controlling her, diminishing her. And yet here she was, brighter than he had ever seen her, while he sat in the shadows like a ghost of the man he once was. When the man's silhouette appeared again, something inside Richard broke. He watched the hand, strong, steady, reach out to Clara's shoulder. She looked up, smiling, her face illuminated by the lamplight. It wasn't just a smile of gratitude, it was joy. Real joy. The kind of joy she had never given him. Richard's body trembled with rage. His breath came in ragged gasps. "That's mine," he hissed. "It's all mine. She can't take it from me. She can't." But even as he whispered, a darker truth pressed into him like a blade. She already had. Richard drove home that night with the streetlights blurring into streaks of white. His hand shook on the wheel. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He whispered into the dark car over and over, "She will not take it from me. She will not take it from me." But the house that greeted him was empty, hollow, suffocating. No Clara, no baby clothes, no laughter, just silence. The silence of a man who had already lost everything but refused to admit it. Richard no longer watched Clara only from the shadows. Now he began taking notes. On a battered legal pad, scribbles covered the pages, dates, times, imagined encounters, scraps of overheard conversations. He wrote down everything as though building a case. "Custody," he muttered as he scrawled the word again and again. "Custody, DNA, proof." The paper tore under the pressure of his pen, but he didn't care. He was a man constructing a fortress out of madness. By day he called lawyers. One after another they rejected him. "Mr. Hale," one had said firmly, "with the documents your wife produced in court, any claim to paternity will be tenuous at best." Another's voice had been colder. "You humiliated her in public, and the press has already painted you as the aggressor. No jury would sympathize with you." He had slammed the phone down each time, rage boiling in his chest. "They don't understand," he hissed into the empty house. "They don't know what's mine." By night, he returned to Clara's street. This time he brought binoculars. He parked farther away, convinced the neighbors were watching him now. Through the lenses he saw her again, moving gracefully through the warm light of her home, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. And always the shadow appeared, the man who lingered close, whose hand brushed hers, who seemed to be building a world around her. Richard's nails scraped against the binoculars until the plastic creaked. He whispered into the dark car, "He won't win. He won't take what's mine." The paranoia grew claws. He started hearing Clara's voice in the walls of his house, whispering at night, mocking him. Calm, always calm. "What do you see now, Richard?" He woke one morning to find his notes scattered across the floor, though he didn't remember throwing them. The word custody glared back at him in black ink, circled a dozen times. His reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. His cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken, his once polished hair greasy and unkempt. But the fire in his eyes was sharp. He wasn't broken, he told himself. He was preparing. He began making phone calls, not just to lawyers, but to anyone who might listen. Old friends, acquaintances, distant relatives. "She's carrying my child," he told them. "You know it's mine. She's trying to erase me." Most hung up. Some laughed bitterly. A few cursed him, but their rejection only fueled him. "They're all blind," he muttered into the silence. "They can't see the truth. But I can. I see it." Meanwhile, Clara's face appeared everywhere. A local newspaper ran a feature about her. "Strength in Silence, Clara Hale's Quiet Triumph." The photograph showed her standing in a sunlit park, a loose dress draping gracefully over her growing stomach, a soft smile on her lips. She looked peaceful, powerful. Richard crumpled the paper in his fist, veins bulging in his neck. "They're worshipping her," he growled. "Worshipping the woman who betrayed me." One night, drunk and trembling, Richard scrawled a new word on the notepad. Revenge. He circled it again and again, the ink smearing under his hand. He pictured Clara standing in court again, her calm eyes steady. He pictured the man beside her, faceless but strong. He pictured the child, his child, reaching for her hand, and he felt the rage rise like fire. "No," he whispered. "No, I won't let her win. She'll see me again. She'll have to. She'll know I am still here." The following Sunday, he returned to the church. He hadn't planned to, but something had pulled him there. The memory of the whispers, the pitying glances, the prayers for the barren wife. He slipped into the back pew, head low, collar turned up. And then he saw her. Clara, seated near the front, radiant as ever. The congregation leaned toward her, women touching her hand, men nodding respectfully. She looked like a queen among them, and beside her, the man again. He passed her a hymnal. Their shoulders brushed. She smiled faintly. Richard's breath came sharp and ragged. He gripped the back of the pew in front of him until the wood groaned. The sermon blurred. The choir was noise. All he saw was Clara glowing in the morning light, the man's hand steady beside hers. It felt like the final betrayal. When the service ended, Clara rose gracefully. The man helped her to her feet, his hand steady on her elbow. The congregation gathered around her, smiles and blessings spilling like rain. Richard ducked low, slipping out before she could see him, but he carried the image with him, Clara, surrounded, supported, untouchable. And he knew then, she was no longer just his wife. She was something more, something greater, something he could never silence, unless he acted. That night, Richard sat at his desk, the whiskey untouched for once. His pen scratched furiously against the page, words spilling like venom. If she thinks she can erase me, she's wrong. If she thinks she can take what's mine, she's wrong. If he thinks he can stand beside her, he's wrong. They're all wrong. I'll prove it. I'll make them see. He underlined the words until the paper tore. The obsession had hardened. Richard was no longer haunted. He was preparing. The rain fell in sheets the night Richard finally decided. He sat at his desk, the notepad in front of him, a battlefield of words, custody, DNA, revenge, mine. The ink bled where his hand had pressed too hard, the paper torn in places. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, his breath shallow. He whispered to himself, "This ends tonight." Clara's house glowed softly at the end of the street, a warm beacon against the storm. Richard parked where he always did, his headlights off, his body shaking with adrenaline. He clutched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Through the rain-smeared windshield, he saw her silhouette in the window. She was seated in the armchair, a book in her lap, one hand resting gently on her stomach. The calm on her face was unbearable. How could she look so serene when he was unraveling piece by piece? Then, the shadow appeared again. The man. His hand rested on the back of Clara's chair, steady, protective. Clara tilted her head toward him, smiling faintly. Richard's chest clenched, a fire tearing through him. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, the horn blaring into the storm. He ducked, cursing under his breath, but no one came to the window. The storm covered his madness. He got out of the car, the rain drenching him instantly. His shoes slapped against the pavement, his steps unsteady, his breath loud in his ears. He reached the gate, gripping it with trembling hands. The iron was cold against his skin. He stood there for a long moment, rain pouring over him, his heart thundering. Then the door opened. Clara stepped outside, an umbrella shielding her from the rain. Her face tilted toward the storm, her calm eyes glancing briefly toward the gate. For a fleeting second, Richard froze. Sure, she could see him standing there in the dark. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even startle. She simply closed the umbrella, set it by the door, and walked back inside. The dignity of it crushed him more than any scream. Richard staggered back, his chest heaving. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't unnoticed. She had seen him, and she had chosen to look right past him, as though he no longer existed. For a man like Richard, that was the deepest cut of all. Days passed, and his madness sharpened into resolve. He filed motions through yet another lawyer, demanding recognition of his rights. The petitions were dismissed almost immediately, the court citing the humiliation, the evidence, the damage he had done. But Richard didn't stop. He sent letters to Clara. None were answered. He left voicemails, his voice slurred with drink. None were returned. He appeared once at her church, standing at the back like a ghost, until the ushers asked him to leave. Every rejection was another nail in the coffin of his pride, and Clara's calm only grew. By the end of the month, Clara was everywhere. The local paper ran another piece praising her resilience, her quiet grace. Neighbors described her as inspiring, a symbol of strength. The congregation celebrated her openly, surrounding her with warmth and respect. Richard's name, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale. He couldn't walk through town without hearing the whispers. There he is, the one who blamed his wife. The Barren husband. The words cut like blades. He began walking faster, ducking his head, avoiding the places he once dominated. He was no longer a man. He was a shadow. But Clara had become untouchable. The final blow came one evening as Richard drove past her street again, unable to resist. This time the lights were on and the curtains open. Clara stood in the living room, surrounded by friends from church, their laughter rising even above the hum of the storm outside. She looked radiant, her belly rounder now, her hand moving gently over it. And there beside her stood the man. His arm rested around her shoulders, steady, protective, certain. The sight snapped something in Richard. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, screaming into the storm. "It's mine. Do you hear me? It's mine." But his voice was swallowed by the thunder. No one heard. When Clara glanced toward the window, her eyes sweeping briefly over the dark street, Richard froze. For a heartbeat, their gazes met through the storm, through the glass, through the years of silence. And in her eyes he saw it. Not fear, not pity, but finality. She wasn't fighting him anymore. She wasn't even acknowledging him. She was done. Richard stumbled back against his seat, chest heaving, his world collapsing. He realized then that the cruelest end was not a scream, not a fight, not even revenge. It was her silence. She had erased him without lifting a finger, and there was nothing left for him to take. Richard's laughter broke into the night, hollow and wild. It echoed in the empty car, blending with the rain. A man once untouchable had become nothing more than a shadow banging against the edges of a life that had already moved on without him. And so, as the storm raged outside, Clara sat inside, her hand on her stomach, her face serene. What do you think happens to Richard now? Does he disappear quietly into the shadows he created for himself? Or will he try one last desperate move to claw back what he's already lost? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your predictions. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming tales.